Hey everyone, thanks for coming to our YouTube channel. Reunion's mission is helping people find their way back to God. And our prayer for you is that you'd encounter God and you'd be filled with more hope by being with us. And today we're starting a new series called Emotionally Healthy Spirituality. If we're being honest with ourselves, we often live out of a fear of what other people might think. We say yes to things simply because we don't want other people to be disappointed. An emotionally healthy spirituality is a way of opening up ourselves to be fully transformed by the gospel. All of us, our way of living and being, our emotions, and what we've learned in the past, our fear of others, all of that can be transformed by the gospel. Before we get to Nathan as he shares about how we need to first know ourselves before we know God, let me share about how you can get connected with Reunion. If you are in the Boston area and you're looking for a community to come alongside you as you wrestle with the hard questions in life, or you're just curious about God, we'd invite you to participate with us in Somerville and Davis Square. We'd love to meet you and join our community as we do this life thing together. You can find all the details on our website, reunionboston.com. If you have your phone handy, also free to scan the QR code using your camera. It'll take you directly to our connection card. Fill out the card and we'll reach out to answer any questions you might have about faith or how you can be a part of our community. You can also follow us on social media. We're on Facebook and Instagram. Now here's Nathan as he shares with us.
Hey everyone, my name is Nathan, and I'm grateful to be with all of you today. Today we're going to kick off a brand new series called Emotionally Healthy Spirituality. And emotionally healthy spirituality is a way of seeing our spirituality in a more kind of holistic setting, meaning the way of Jesus should form all of us. It should form every aspect of our being, not just what we do, but how we see ourselves, how we engage with our feelings and our emotions. In short, the premise of this idea in this series is that you cannot be spiritually mature and remain emotionally immature. Christian spirituality, without an integration into our emotional health, can be deadly. And that's to ourselves and to our relationship with God and to the people around us. And the person who kind of came up with this idea of emotionally healthy spirituality is a guy named Pete Scazzero. He is a pastor in New York, and he was a pastor in New York for a very long time. And he came to this idea after a few really quite traumatic experiences in his life. And one of those experiences he documents in his book. Apparently one summer afternoon, he was preaching in his church in New York, and this church held multiple gatherings on a Sunday morning. And in between their second and third, a couple approached him. And this couple was visiting from Connecticut, and they were just kind of hoping to have some time with Pete and his wife, Jerry, after their services concluded that day. Now, Pete hears all of this, and he kind of openly confesses that he did not want to host this couple. He was tired. He was frustrated with the day. He hadn't really seen his family, and he just wanted to spend some time at home with them uninterrupted after having a very busy weekend. But also, he felt this kind of nagging pressure to be a host, to be gracious, and most importantly, by his own admittance, to not be viewed by this couple as a disappointment. And he also admitted that he had a friend that was a mutual friend between him and this other couple who was also a pastor, and he was worried that pastor might think less of him if he rejected this couple. And because of his insecurities and his fears, instead of doing what he wanted or doing what he felt was probably the healthiest thing for him to do, he instead invited this couple over to his house for lunch after their gatherings concluded. And unsurprisingly, when they arrived later that day, his wife was not happy about it. But still, again, trying to be a gracious host, they sat down together to share a meal. And here's where the problem really kind of started to kick in. A guy that was invited over, he's identified in the book as a guy named John. And he starts talking during lunch. Apparently a lot. And nonstop. As in no one else is able to get a word in. And this goes on for what they describe as multiple hours before finally there's a break in the conversation. John has to go take a phone call, and his wife, Susan, went to use the restroom. And Jerry hears she's, has a moment alone with Pete, and she looks over at him and really just kind of lets out some of her frustration. And before long, John and Susan, they came back, and John starts talking again. And I guess at one point, John paused during the conversation and said, "I hope I'm not talking too much." And Pete admits, despite having, that opportunity, he was too afraid to end the lunch and end the conversation. So he responds with, "Of course not." After this, he says, "I was too afraid to look over at my wife." And after another hour or so, Jerry finally got in a word when she blurted out, "I haven't heard from Faith in a while." Now, Faith was their youngest daughter. She was 3 years old at the time. But even with all this going on, John just continues to talk as if no one else had said a word. And after some nervous glances and another long stint of listening to John, Jerry finally excuses herself. And she does it in a fairly annoyed voice, as Pete recalls, so she could go and check on their daughter. So she darts to the basement, and when she gets there, she realizes there's no Faith there. She goes to the bedrooms, no Faith. She looks around the living room, no Faith. She runs to the dining room, no Faith. And after all of this, she's getting panicked. She runs back to the kitchen and she declares, "Pete, I can't find her. She's not here." And the next line that Pete writes is chilling. I just want to give that warning. Because he says, "Horror gripped us both as our eyes locked for a nanosecond. We were both pondering the unthinkable. The pool." The two of them rushed to the backyard. And in their backyard, they had kind of a 3-foot tall, above ground pool. And somehow their 3-year-old had climbed up and over the stairs and gotten into the pool. She was stuck. She was standing on her tiptoes because water was just about to reach her mouth. Luckily, they were able to get to her immediately, and they were able to help her out of the pool, and she was safe. They have no idea how long she was out there. And he writes that he is well aware of what could have happened to their family on that day. However, when he writes this story, he reflects on it. He doesn't blame John and Susan. He doesn't blame really anybody, except kind of himself. He acknowledges that he was most concerned with how this couple would have perceived him if he had done anything to upset them or disappoint them. He says that as he was listening to John talk, kind of unconsciously, he was thinking, "I hope this couple will like us. Will they think that we are okay? Will John give a good report of his visit to my pastor friend?" And he closes his story with these words: "Pretending was safer than honesty and vulnerability." The reality was that my discipleship and spirituality had not touched a number of deep internal wounds and sin patterns. Especially those ugly ones that emerged behind the closed doors of our home during trials, disagreements, conflicts, and setbacks. I was stuck at an immature level of spiritual and emotional development, and my then present way of living the Christian life was not transforming the deep places of my life. And because of that, faith almost died. Something was dreadfully wrong with my spirituality. Maybe, I'm assuming for most of us, our story might not be that drastic. And yet at the same time, I bet many of us know what this feeling is like. We live out of a fear of what other people might think. We say yes to things simply because we don't want other people to be disappointed. Our family taught us how to handle conflict, but in a really unhealthy way. And we don't know how to do it any differently now that we're adults. See, emotionally healthy spirituality is a way of opening ourselves up to be fully transformed by the gospel. All of us, all of our being, our way of living, our emotions, what we've learned in the past, our fear of others, all of that can be transformed by the gospel. And I'm personally really excited about this series because emotionally healthy spirituality has been so transformative in my life. As I've journeyed to understand myself better, it's transformed a lot of my spiritual life as well. I had a story Not as drastic, but similar to Pete's. I struggled to live into other people's expectations. I was always worried about what others thought and whether or not I was disappointing people. I was afraid that people were going to be upset with me or frustrated with me. So I said yes to things even when I knew it wasn't healthy. And I agreed to things that weren't good for me or for my family. And I did it completely out of fear. And in the midst of all this, I'd started going to therapy, and my therapist recommended a book to me. And the book was called When People Are Big and God is Small. And there's this paragraph in the book that really described how I was for a long time in my life and in my ministry. The author, Ed Welch, wrote this: "We fear people because they can expose and humiliate us. We fear people because they can reject, ridicule, and despise us. We fear people because they can attack, oppress, or threaten us. These three reasons have one thing in common. They see people as bigger, that is, more powerful and significant than God. And out of the fear that creates in us, we give other people the power and right to tell us what to feel, think, and do." Emotionally healthy spirituality, it really helps free me from some of that. It's definitely still a process that's going on in my life, but I know that I've made huge strides, and that's because of the work of emotionally healthy spirituality. It's allowed me to learn about myself and live into my true self. That's really what Pete is talking about here. He wasn't able to be his true self, to say what he really felt. He was living a false version of himself, a really kind of polished version that he was trying to present, hoping that it would help others like him more. And I should say this false self idea, that's not my own language. Writers and spiritual leaders throughout Christian history have called this identity our false selves, the us that we kind of pretend to be, or the us that we try to convince others that we really are. In his book, Confessions, St. Augustine wrote, "How can you draw close to God when you are far from your own self?" And he added this line, "Grant, Lord, that I may know myself, that I may know thee." And St. Teresa of Avila had a similar idea in her writings. In The Way of Perfectionism, she writes, "Almost all problems in the spiritual life stem from a lack of self-knowledge." See, it's the conclusion as to why so many of us live into our false selves that might surprise us. Because many early church fathers and mothers suggested that many of us live into our false selves because we have not done the inner work to learn and know our true selves. We're too afraid that our true selves might hurt or offend others, that our true selves will be rejected. So we continue to live into other people's desires or expectations, believing that it is safer than it would be for us to be our true selves. But what if there was another way? What if there was a better path forward? A path that allowed us to live into our true selves rather than feeling the need to appease those around us? What if we could fully live into what we felt rather than to submitting to all the demands and expectations that are often killing our joy and our energy? See, I think there's a story in the Old Testament that really shows us how we can live into this different way. A story that shows us what it looks like to live from our true selves. And that story involves a very famous figure in the Old Testament, a man by the name of David. Now, maybe you've heard of David, and when you think about the David you've heard of, you think about the king of Israel. Or maybe you've heard people say that David was a man after God's own heart. Maybe you know David is the person who wrote a number of the Psalms or poems that we find in the early parts of Scripture. And all of that is true, but before all of that happened, David was a lowly shepherd. And the reason that he was a shepherd was because that he was the youngest of 8 brothers, meaning he looked around the house, and as they looked at the jobs that needed to be done, that was the one that was given to David because no one else wanted to do it. It wasn't a glamorous job, but somebody kind of had to do it. And in this case, the youngest son is who the job fell on. So all that to say, David is not living a great, glamorous, exciting, fun life. David, who many of us know as the soldier and king, started his life tending sheep in a field by himself because no one else wanted to do it. But one day something happened in David's life. There's this man named Samuel, and he shows up to their house. Samuel was the prophet in the land of Israel, and God had sent Samuel to Jesse, David's father's house, because he was going to anoint a new and future king of Israel. And what's crazy about this story is that when Samuel shows up to look at Jesse's sons, David doesn't even make the cut. All the other brothers come out to be looked over by Samuel, except for David. He's the one that's left alone in the field. He's the one that's not even considered for the position. Until Samuel looks at all the other brothers, and then he doesn't pick any of them. And he asks Jesse about any more sons, and Jesse finally calls for David. David, a son that was last on his father's mind, is the one that God chose. In fact, Samuel didn't even get to have the final say in this decision. Samuel is looking at the older brothers, and he thinks all of them are perfect for the job, and he is just waiting for God to choose one of them. And it's only when God lets Samuel know that he's looking at the wrong thing, that Samuel is looking at the outside appearance, and God is looking at the heart, that Samuel begins to understand. And in 1 Samuel 16, when David comes out, we read this: "Then the Lord said, 'Rise and anoint him. This is the one.'" David is getting anointed king of Israel. This should be a monumental day in his life. Like, this is a great movie. An outcast, the one that was overlooked, becomes the king. And yet here's the thing. That's the end of the story for a while. We don't see this like glamorous passing of power from the current king named Saul to David. There's no succession plan. There's no triumphal entry as David goes to take his spot on the throne. David doesn't get a primetime special that's aired around the world. He's not on the front page of the tabloids for the next week. He's anointed king, and then he leaves to go back to the field to watch sheep. I mean, the story even kind of seems to indicate that his family like rolls their eyes and they all move on like nothing had happened. And life goes back to usual for the new king of Israel. That is, until a few chapters later. In 1 Samuel 17, Israel finds themselves in a battle with another nation, the Philistines. And Israel had called everyone together to form their army, and that included David's brothers, all of them. All of them went to fight except David. Future king is told to stay home and to watch sheep. And I'm not just pointing all this out because I'm trying to like pick on David or something. Can you imagine what this might have done to him? When so many people tell you that you don't matter, it's easy to start to listen. When you're told over and over again that all you were ever going to be is a shepherd, I imagine it's easy to start to believe that. David could have easily shrunk back into people's expectations of him. And in just a few verses, a moment is going to come to see if David is going to live into his true self, the version of him that God has called him to be, or his false self, the demands and expectations that everyone else is putting on him. Because David is about to show up to the camp of Israel's army, and he's about to hear the challenge of a man named Goliath, a giant of a man who is challenging someone in the Israelite camp to come and fight him. And while everyone else cowers at the thought of fighting this giant, David is going to entertain the idea. David is confident in what God can do in him and through him. We'll pick up the story in 1 Samuel 17, verse 26, where we read this. David asked the men standing near him, "What will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" And they repeated to him what they had been saying and told him, "This is what will be done for the man who kills him." When Eliab, David's oldest brother, heard him speaking with the men, he burned with anger at him and asked, "Why have you come down here? And with whom did you leave those few sheep in the wilderness? I know how conceited you are and how wicked your heart is. You came down only to watch the battle." So, just kind of curious as to what's going on, David begins to ask around, and he hears the story of Goliath's challenge. He hears what will happen to the man who fights and defeats Goliath. But someone else is watching David ask these questions. And the first challenge to David's true self was waiting at the camp for him. Because David's oldest brother, Eliab, he sees David there, and he does not want him to be in their camp. He starts to challenge David, almost to mock him and belittle him. He insults David and accuses him of having a wicked heart. I mean, you can sense what is happening below the surface of Eliab: anger and bitterness and jealousy. And how does that come out in the story? I mean, Eliab basically looks at David and says, "Why don't you run back to your sheep, little boy?" Now, I'm going to guess no one has called you a shepherd as an insult. But I think in some way, many of us have been here. We've had moments in our lives where we get some kind of feedback. We're told something about ourselves, and we're tempted to fall into the cycle of fear and anxiety. We're tempted to overwork ourselves or to change ourselves so we can live into others' expectations of us. And that is the choice that David has to face now. Because you can sense he's considering fighting Goliath. He's asking what's going on. He wants to hear why no one has challenged Goliath yet. His true self is telling him to stay and to fight, that he is the future king of Israel, that God is going to be with him during this time, but his false self is telling him to run back home. Listening to his brother, doing what is easy and safe. His false self is telling him to go back home. He has to decide which self he's going to follow. "Now, what have I done?" said David. "Can't I even speak?" He then turned away to someone else and brought up the same matter. The men answered him as before. What David said was overheard and reported to Saul, and Saul sent for him. David chooses to stay. David follows his true self, believing that he is king. He came to this camp for a reason. So he sets out to begin gathering information about Goliath. He continues to ask the other soldiers, and they all give him the same report as before. But as he's asking around and trying to prepare himself for what is ahead, word is going to travel about this boy who is planning to accept Goliath's challenge. And word is going to spread all the way to the current king, Saul. And here's the thing about this challenge. See, the whole battle hinged on this one fight. The challenge that Goliath is presenting is a one-on-one fight, sure. But the stakes are so high because whoever wins this fight is going to win the entire battle. This isn't something to take lightly. You can imagine that Saul is not going to allow some unprepared teenager to jump into the fight. Saul wants to know what's going on with this kid, and he calls for him so Saul can see him. Read on. David said to Saul, "Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him." And Saul replied, "You're not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him. You are only a young man, and he has been a warrior from his youth. But David said to Saul, your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair and struck it and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. The uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of the Philistine. Saul said to David, go, and the Lord be with you. This is the second time David is tempted to live into his false self. And Saul looks at him and says, he's too small. He's too weak. He can't fight Goliath. Again, go home. But David answers with a story. Story of a time he fought a lion and a bear as he was protecting his father's sheep. And at first I thought, like, man, he is really trying to convince Saul about how strong he is. It's almost like he's saying, like, I fought a lion and a bear. A big human is not that much of a challenge. But I wonder, as I revisit this story, if this is less to convince Saul and more a way to display a confidence in his true self. I mean, what if this is David's true self coming out? What if he's simply saying, you might be nervous about me fighting Goliath, but I'm not. I know who I am. I know what I can do. And I know and I trust that God will be with me. And maybe Saul picks up on this. Or maybe Saul's just like, a lion and a bear. All right, let's give this kid a shot. But either way, he agrees to allow David to accept this challenge. But not without one last temptation for David. Then Saul dressed David in his own tunic, and he put a coat of armor on him and a bronze helmet on his head. David fastened on his sword over the tunic and tried walking around because he was not used to them. I cannot go in these, he said to Saul, because I'm not used to them. So he took them off. Then he took his staff in his hand and he chose 5 smooth stones from the stream, put them in the pouch of his shepherd's bag, and with his sling in hand approached the Philistine. Saul's willing to let David go. Saul is more than happy to let David fight this battle, but only under a condition. That David dress like Saul. That David look like Saul. That David fights like Saul. I mean, I think this is the clearest example of the false self that we have in the story. Saul wanted David to fully be something and someone that he was not. Imagine the devastation if David had agreed to fight in this way. David was too afraid to be his true self, and he tried to lug all of this armor out onto the battlefield and fight in the way that Saul wanted and expected him to. But one more time, we see that David is fully secure in who he is, and he is confident in being that person, even if it disappoints those around him. So what's he do? Takes the armor off. He prepares to fight in his own way, with stones and a sling. He walks out onto the battlefield to meet Goliath. Meanwhile, the Philistine, with his shield bearer in front of him, kept coming closer to David. He looked David over and saw that he was little more than a boy, glowing with health and handsome, and he despised him. He said to David, am I a dog that you come at me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. Come here, he said, and I'll give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals. David said to the Philistine, you come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. David has the chance to run away one last time. See, it was all talk up until this point. Standing there, across the valley from a giant. I just have to believe that the temptation to run would have been overwhelming. But David chose to stay. I think his final line is really what shows us the beauty of living into our true self can be. Because David doesn't live into his true self because he's motivated by his own self-confidence. He lives into his true self because he is confident in who God is and who God created David to be. He doesn't have to live up to others' expectations because he is so confident in who God has made him. This is really why the true self is so essential for us. When we are constantly looking at others to define us, to tell us what we need to do and who we need to be, we might miss the calling that God has placed on our lives. When we are so afraid of others seeing us as people that are failing or people that are broken, we might miss the healing that is being offered to us and the community that comes when we sit together and we show our scars. The gospel wants to free us from this because the gospel wants to define who we are. The gospel wants to tell us that we are daughters and sons of the God of the cosmos, that we have been adopted into the family of God. And despite all our flaws and despite our brokenness, we still inherit all the beauty and the promise that comes with being God's children. See, like God did with David, God looks at all of us and says, this is the one. That is what God thinks of us. And when we allow the gospel to define us in this way, it frees us from the need to hide. It frees us from the need to seek outside validation as our main form of acceptance and confidence. The gospel tells us that we can show our brokenness and we can waver in our self-confidence, but God sees all of that and loves all of that and offered himself to help us heal and grow through all of that. We can know ourselves more because that allows us to see the spaces God wants to mold and shape our souls and the ways God wants to form us into his image more closely. So how do we begin this work of understanding our true selves? And what can we do to help us learn to live into our true selves more fully? Well, Pete Scazzaro recommends 4 ways that he suggests can help us identify, grow, and live into our true selves. And the first is to take time to pay attention to our interior in silence and solitudes. See, one of the greatest enemies of knowing and living into our true selves is distraction. Like I said, this is challenging work. And so many distractions try to keep us from listening to our feelings, our desires, our dreams, our likes, and our dislikes. And that doesn't even account for people who show up and want to fix us or define us or save us. We need to be alone so we can listen. We need to be alone so we can assess what is going on inside of us. Some helpful questions to help us as we sit in silence might be things like, why am I always in a hurry? Why am I so anxious? Why do I dread this meeting today? Why am I so flooded with fear? Why do I have a need to immediately return all phone calls and emails? And as we sit with those questions, one practice that I found to be very helpful is to add some time of journaling when we take time to pray. We can take time each day to feel the entire weight of our emotions before God, and then just journal out how we feel, to process those questions and write out why we think they might be weighing on our hearts. And as we do this over time, we'll begin to discern patterns in our lives, and we'll see how God is moving in our interior life. When we slow down and take inventory of our interior life, when we create space and silence and solitude to be our true selves before God, without any fear of what others might think, it allows us to know our truest self better and learn how to live into that self once we leave the silence and solitude. Another way to help us discover our true selves is to find trusted companions. And when we talk about making a shift to live into our true selves, we're talking about making shifts kind of at the core of our being. And we're usually hindered in making these changes by the pressure of others and by our own stubbornness. And having companions along in this journey to point out where those two things are winning is crucial. Maybe you need friends to help you out, or mentors, or church community. But the reality is that we cannot make these changes on our own. We need others around us. And in order for us to fully live into our true selves, we're going to have to move out of our comfort zone. This past week, I was listening to a hockey podcast, believe it or not. And on it, they were noting that there's this trend in hockey, but really kind of in sports as a whole. That what they notice is that the home team always seems to get a few more calls that go in their favor than the away team does. And the reason for that is because of the reaction of the home crowd. And one of the hosts made a comment, and I can't remember his exact wording, but it was something to the effect of very similar to, it's crazy how we live so much of our life just to avoid getting yelled at. See, living out of our false self is something that we often do as a means of protecting ourselves. We don't want to disappoint someone else. We're afraid that they will get mad at us if we are our true selves. They want us to be something, and it feels easier to just be that than to live into our true selves. But living into our true selves is going to require that we leave our comfort zone. The truth is, comfort zone, it might be a comfortable place to be, but often it isn't a healthy place for us to live. And leaving it might be incredibly helpful for us, but it will also be a challenge. That's why the last thing we must do is pray for courage. Pray for the courage to step into our true selves and find that God might be meeting us there and shaping our souls when we're willing to live into our true selves. Yeah, I'm praying that all of us would find the courage to shed our false selves today. And I'm praying that all of us will begin our journey towards emotionally healthy spirituality, that we'll be doing it right now. Thank you so much for joining us today. Let me turn things back over to Matt.
Let's close with our benediction. As you leave today, remember who you are, a holy and treasured being, fully loved and liked by God. When life is difficult this week, and know that it will be difficult, remember who you are. When you're confronted with pain, stress, and anxiety, remember who you are. If old wounds reopen, if shame takes hold, if new struggles emerge, remember who you are. Remember and take courage. God is with you, knows you, cares for you, and will see you to the end. And remember, God has given you this beautiful community to share in your burdens and your joys. So go now in the name of our loving God, the forgiving Christ, and our guide, the Holy Spirit. Amen. Go in peace and live the church.